True Crime, Murder 101, Alex Campbell's Classroom, and the question no one could close, the Sociology class that refused to move on. 6 Unnamed Women, a highway pattern, and a lesson that refused to stay academic. The question looked almost too large for a classroom board. How do you find one person among hundreds of millions? Alex Campbell was standing in front of a sociology class at Elizabethton High School in northeastern Tennessee. The students were used to assignments with defined edges, a chapter, a deadline, an answer that already existed somewhere in a textbook. This one offered none of those comforts. It began with scattered records, old descriptions, and women whose identities had been replaced by the counties where they were found. The students did not have badges, subpoenas, or access to an evidence room. They had internet searches, public documents, archived reports, notebooks, and the freedom to ask why details had never been assembled in quite the same way before. At first, the exercise was meant to make sociology practical. It would examine institutions, marginalization, criminal behavior, public attention, and the unequal value society can place on different lives. Then the class began seeing the same features repeated: red or reddish hair, interstate corridors, small physical builds, social disconnection, and files that had gone quiet. The first explanation was simple. These were separate mysteries joined by coincidence and a memorable label. The harder possibility was that the label was hiding a pattern. This is the story of how a school assignment became a sustained investigation, why the students' work mattered, where their theory met official evidence, and why the most responsible version of the story still contains firm limits. The classroom did not possess magic knowledge. It did something more useful. It organized neglect, until neglect became visible. The classroom around Alex Campbell. Elizabethton sits in the Appalachian foothills, far from the image of a national investigative center. Campbell had taught at the high school for years and was looking for a way to make sociology feel immediate. A grant-supported culture of project-based learning encouraged students to apply classroom concepts to real problems rather than simply repeat definitions on an exam. The idea that emerged was ambitious enough to sound improbable. Examine a group of unresolved files associated with women who had red or reddish hair and were connected, at least geographically, to the American South and its interstate system. Campbell did not present the students as miniature detectives who could replace trained investigators. The educational logic was broader. Sociology asks how people are categorized, how institutions behave, why certain communities receive attention and why others do not. The files gave those questions human weight. A missing record, an unidentified woman, or a contradictory age estimate was not merely bad data. It could be the reason a family never knew where someone had gone. Parents and school leaders were told that the project would involve difficult material, including exploitation, drugs, and sex work. The support mattered because the class was not consuming a polished mystery. Students would encounter incomplete records, stigmatizing language, and the unsettling possibility that some women had been treated as disposable because they were transient, estranged from relatives, or believed to have sold sex. Campbell's project asked teenagers to resist that hierarchy, rather than repeat it. That became the first ethical boundary of the assignment. The women could not remain labels. Students were divided into groups and given individual files to research. They compared physical descriptions, locations, dates, clothing, dental information, and possible movements. They also tried to recover personhood from records that offered only fragments. The class soon discovered that persistence can be uncomfortable. Old information did not fit neatly. Ages had been estimated differently. Hair colors varied from red to strawberry blonde or brown, with reddish tones. Some files involved strangulation. Others involved blunt force injury or an undetermined cause. Some women were found near interstates, while others were farther away. The project would depend on distinguishing a genuine pattern from the human tendency to force similarities together. That discipline became more important as the students grew invested. A classroom can reward a confident answer. An unresolved file demands the opposite: the willingness to leave a box empty. The students closest to the question. The original work began in the spring of 2018. Students searched archives, divided the files, and shared discoveries across groups. The assignment did not end when the semester did. Later, students inherited the material, revisited the connections, and brought new expertise into the room. Years afterward, Marley Mathena and Riley Whitson continued the research outside normal class time, meeting Campbell before school and working through developments that had emerged since the first presentation. Their method was not sophisticated because it used secret technology. It was sophisticated because it forced comparison. One group might notice a highway route. Another might find that an age estimate had changed. A third might trace an unidentified person to a missing person report in another state. Campbell became the contact point, making calls and approaching people with specialist knowledge when students found a lead that deserved scrutiny. The class also connected with outside researchers who had examined similar files. One independent investigator had arrived at a group of 6 women before speaking with Campbell. The students had selected the same 6. That did not prove one offender was responsible, but the independent overlap suggested that the cluster was not arbitrary. It gave the class a working set of cases against which a possible profile could be tested. The profile was built from victim characteristics, disposal locations, and the apparent use of interstate corridors. Students considered someone who could travel without attracting attention, who understood highways, and who might encounter women needing transport. A long-haul truck driver became a central possibility. They also explored whether the offender selected women who appeared socially isolated because delayed reporting or weak connections between jurisdictions reduced the chance of rapid identification. Some profile details relied more on behavioral convention than direct proof. That illustrates a basic risk. Once a later person resembles a prediction, the matches can appear more precise than they were. The students' strongest contribution was not a psychological portrait. It was the construction of a research network. They treated each file as part of a larger information problem, sought specialists in forensics, knot analysis, criminal investigation and prosecution, and asked how much weight different similarities should carry. By 2023, the students were presenting updated findings to law enforcement representatives and the public after several years of work. Their age became part of the story, but it should not obscure the process. They had time, curiosity, and a willingness to reopen assumptions. Old records are often distributed across agencies, decades, and naming systems. A classroom cannot repair all of those systems. It can expose where the joins are weak. The first pattern that did not fit. The shorthand attached to the records suggested a coherent series built around women with red or reddish hair. The historical picture was never that settled. Agencies in several states had compared possible links during the 1980s, but differences among the files prevented a single, agreed explanation. Even the number of women who might belong together changed depending on which features a researcher treated as essential. That uncertainty did not weaken the project. It defined it. A pattern can be useful without being complete. Shared geography, appearance, timing, and interstate proximity can help researchers decide which records deserve comparison. Yet every similarity has to be tested against how common it might be. Highways naturally appear in the lives of mobile people. Hair color is memorable, but descriptions can vary through dye, lighting, and the quality of old records. Social isolation can make someone harder to trace without proving that one person deliberately selected everyone in the group. The students therefore faced 2 competing dangers. Was to treat every resemblance as coincidence and allow potentially connected records to remain isolated. The other was to build a single narrative so persuasive that every difference began to look unimportant. The first tension concerned the women themselves. The 6 original files described adults with different backgrounds, one known identity, and several county-based labels. Some accounts suggested hitchhiking, temporary travel, or sex work, but those descriptions were not equally established in every file. A category intended to help comparison could quickly flatten distinct leaves into one type. The second tension concerned the conditions recorded in each file. Some details aligned closely. Others did not. A genuine connection can contain variation, but variation also makes it easier to pull unrelated records into the same theory. The students did not need to eliminate every uncertainty before their work had value. Their immediate goal became more concrete: attract attention, recover names, and prompt people with information to look again. A name could reconnect one record to another and identify relatives able to provide comparison material. They were beginning to understand that the central question was not simply who might connect the files. It was why so many records had remained disconnected for so long. The highways behind the files. Once the project moved from abstraction into the historical record, the violence could no longer be avoided. The 6 files chosen by the class involved women found in Tennessee, Arkansas, Mississippi, and Kentucky, commonly near major roads. Several had been strangled or suffocated. Others had injuries or circumstances that made homicide likely. Most entered public memory through geography rather than identity. Campbell County Jane Doe, Cheatham County Jane Doe, Knox County Jane Doe, DeSoto County Jane Doe, and Greene County Jane Doe. One woman was already known. Lisa Nichols, 28, was found near Interstate 40 in Arkansas in September 1984 and identified through fingerprints. The other files contained the kinds of details that are both intimate and insufficient: a dental plate, freckles, painted nails, a scar, jewelry, clothing, height estimates, and hair described in slightly different shades. The Campbell County woman was found near Interstate 75 on New Year's Day in 1985. She had been bound, strangled, and wrapped in bedding. Investigators preserved her clothing and the material around her, but she remained unidentified for decades. The Cheatham County woman was found near Interstate 24 in March. Her skeletal remains had been exposed long enough to make both identification and cause of death analysis difficult. In Kentucky, a woman was found inside a discarded refrigerator near a highway. She had suffocated. Local residents attended a funeral for someone whose name they did not know. In Mississippi, another red-haired woman was found near a bridge beside a highway after ligature strangulation. In Greene County, Tennessee, a young woman was found near an interstate exit with injuries indicating blunt force trauma. The similarities warranted comparison, but could not erase the differences. The phrase serial killer can make every file feel solved before any one file is proved, while official investigations remained case-specific and unevenly supported. The highways were more than cinematic scenery. They were an investigative obstacle. A person could be picked up in one state, harmed in another, and found in a third. The agency receiving the body might not know where the journey began. Before national databases became more effective, a missing person report and an unidentified remains file could coexist without meeting. The road connected the cases in the classroom. In the official record, it also explained why connection was so difficult. The press conference that changed the temperature. In May 2018, the class brought its work into public view. Students presented the 6 files, the similarities they had identified, and the possibility of one mobile offender. The event was designed partly to generate attention for women who still lacked names. Once the story circulated, tips and renewed interest followed. Publicity can help a cold case, but it can also distort it. The image of students pursuing a forgotten serial killer offered a clean story. The actual work was slower and dependent on specialists and laboratory processes outside the classroom. The class did not perform the fingerprint comparisons, DNA testing, or forensic genealogy. Its role was catalytic. It widened attention, while investigators revisited evidence with improved technology. Within months, several women recovered their names. The Kentucky woman was identified as S.B. Regina Black Pilgrim, after relatives provided DNA. The Greene County victim was identified as Elizabeth Lamott, a 17-year-old from New Hampshire, after family DNA entered national systems and produced a match. The Campbell County woman was identified through fingerprints as Tina Marie Mack Kenny Farmer of Indiana. The identifications did not prove a serial series. They did something more fundamental. They changed the question from, "Who was this woman?" to, Where had she been? Who knew her, and what evidence could now be compared? Tina's identification was especially important because her clothing and the bedding preserved from the scene still existed. A TBI agent had resubmitted those items for testing in November 2016. Laboratory examination detected semen, and a DNA profile entered into the National Offender Database produced a match to Jerry Leon Johns. The identity work and the evidence work converged around the same file. The class had predicted that a truck driver might sit at the center of the pattern. Johns had worked as a trucker. That resemblance gave the student profile its dramatic payoff. It also created a new responsibility. Separate the part that matched from the part that remained theory. Tina Farmer, the blanket, and the name in the database. Tina Farmer was 21 and from Indiana. By the time investigators identified her, her family had lived for more than 3 decades without the answer contained in a fingerprint card. Her body had been found in Campbell County on January 1, 1985, several days after she died. The official investigation concluded that she had been strangled. The preserved bedding became the decisive object. Semen detected during renewed testing produced a DNA profile that matched Johns through the combined DNA index system. That match established his biological connection to the material associated with Tina's body. Investigators then examined his history and found an event from only 2 months after Tina was discovered. Johns had picked up another red-haired woman in Knox County. He bound and strangled her, then left her beside Interstate 40, believing she would not survive. She did. Her account led to his arrest, and he was convicted in 1987 of aggravated kidnapping, assault, and other offenses. He remained in custody until his death in December 2015. The similarities were stark. A red-haired woman, restraint, strangulation, and abandonment near an interstate. For investigators, the prior attack did not merely make Johns look generally dangerous. It supplied a closely comparable method, geography, and victim characteristic. Combined with the DNA result, it gave the Tina Farmer file a level of proof absent from the broader series theory. In December 2019, a Campbell County grand jury reviewed the evidence. Officials stated that Johns would have been indicted for first-degree murder had he still been alive. The finding could not produce a prosecution or trial, but it allowed authorities to state who they believed killed Tina. This is where the public shorthand and the legal record separate. The shorthand says, "The students caught the killer behind at least 6 murders." The official record is narrower. They revived attention. Tina was identified. Preserved evidence linked Johns to her case, and investigators connected it to a similar attack for which he had been convicted. Johns is therefore not simply a name produced by classroom profiling. He is tied by DNA to Tina's file, and by a conviction to another near-fatal interstate attack. Yet no equivalent official finding has publicly linked him to every woman in the classroom's 6-file cluster. The distinction does not diminish the students. It prevents a powerful story from consuming the women whose cases remain individually unresolved. The survivor, who turned a theory into a human account. The woman who survived Johns's attack could describe a method that a file alone could not. Public accounts identify her as Linda Shack. He restrained and strangled her, but the collar of her leather jacket helped her survive. Her testimony contributed to his conviction. For decades, she kept much of the experience private. When Campbell eventually spoke with her, the classroom project encountered the difference between studying a pattern and hearing from someone who had lived through it. A method described as strangulation and roadside disposal becomes something else when the person who endured it explains the sequence, the restraint, and the decision to leave her behind. Her survival also sharpened the evidentiary logic. Similarity alone can mislead. Here, however, investigators had a known offender, a surviving witness, a conviction, a strikingly comparable attack, and DNA connected to Tina's preserved bedding. Each strand answered a different question. The witness established what Johns had done in one documented event. The conviction showed that the event had been tested in court. The DNA placed him within Tina's evidence. The timing and interstate geography supported comparison. What those strands could not do was record every private moment in Tina's case, or establish that Johns committed every other homicide associated with red-haired women. The evidence could identify a responsible person in one file without proving a complete series. That limit is one of the most important lessons in Murder 101. True crime narratives reward total explanations. Investigations often produce partial certainty. One name restored, one offender linked, one family answered, and several files still open. The survivor's role also corrects the instinct to place all narrative gravity on the offender. Johns's biography, criminal history, and possible motives may attract attention, but the strongest account comes from the woman whose survival created evidence. Without her, the later DNA match would still matter. With her, investigators could see that the match corresponded to a demonstrated pattern of behavior, rather than an isolated, unexplained presence. The most valuable witness in the story was not the person who inspired a profile. It was the person who lived long enough to challenge him. 4 names returned, but the series stayed unsettled. The identification work continued after the first wave of attention. Michelle Lavone Inman, whose remains were found near Interstate 24 in Cheatham County in March 1985, was identified in July 2023 through forensic genetic genealogy. Investigators learned that she was from Nashville and had a brother who had not heard from her in more than 4 decades. Her homicide remains under investigation. Elizabeth Lamotte's identification exposed another institutional gap. She had been 17 when she left a youth facility in Manchester, New Hampshire, in late 1984. Her remains were found in Tennessee months later, but her identity was not restored until family DNA connected the records in 2018. The investigation into her death remains open. S.B. Regina Black Pilgrim's family connection arrived through DNA after a relative believed the unidentified Kentucky woman might be their missing mother. Her case remains a separate homicide investigation. Lisa Nichols had received her name much earlier through fingerprints, but the circumstances of her death also remain unresolved in the public record. Together, the identifications reveal why the classroom project mattered, even where its serial killer theory cannot be confirmed. A Jane Doe file is difficult to investigate because officers lack a starting geography, social network, and last known movement. A named person creates routes backward: family, workplaces, relationships, prior arrests, hospitals, shelters, truck stops, addresses, and witnesses. Names can also disprove a theory. Once investigators know where someone lived and when she disappeared, they can compare the timeline with a suspected offender's documented movements. A restored identity may strengthen a link, weaken it, or point toward an entirely different perpetrator. Claims that the students directly identified 4 victims need care. They focused attention and sustained interest, while investigators, analysts, relatives, and forensic scientists completed the official work. The broader series remains unsettled because the cases do not all share the same evidentiary foundation. Tina's file has a DNA match and a comparable surviving victim. Michelle's public case information does not identify an offender. Elizabeth's homicide remains active. SB's case remains unresolved. The Mississippi woman in the 6-file cluster still lacks a publicly confirmed identity. A single dramatic answer would be emotionally cleaner. The evidence is not obligated to be clean. Tracy Sue Walker and the new direction of the search. One of the most revealing developments concerns a girl who was not originally included in the core 6 because her age appeared inconsistent with the pattern. Her partial skeletal remains were found in the Big Wheel Gap area of Campbell County in April 1985. Investigators called her Baby Girl. Forensic genetic genealogy finally identified her in 2022 as Tracy Sue Walker, a 15-year-old from Lafayette, Indiana, who had vanished in 1978. The identification gave Tracy a specific last evening, a location, and witnesses who could potentially be re-examined. In May 2025, the TBI and Elizabethton students launched a renewed public appeal. Officials said Tracy had been dropped off with a friend near a McDonald's, before she was last seen outside a department store getting into a car with a group of older men. Investigators believe the men were temporarily working in the Lafayette area, left Indiana with her, and eventually brought her to Tennessee. They have also said the group may have been organized, and Tracy may not have been their only victim. A $10,000 reward was announced for information leading to an arrest and conviction. That official theory matters, because it does not simply fold Tracy into the Johns narrative. It points toward multiple men, and asks people in Campbell County to remember relationships, work crews, and local knowledge from the period. Investigators believe someone still holds the information needed to identify whoever was responsible. The students supported the appeal with yard signs, postcards, flyers, and a vehicle wrapped with Tracy's image and a link to further information. The work had moved beyond profiling. It had become a public information campaign, built around one named girl and one unresolved route from Indiana to Tennessee. This is the clearest example of the project maturing. The first class asked whether one offender connected a cluster. The later work accepts that different answers may exist. One file can be linked to John's. Another may involve a group. Others may remain unresolved because the necessary witness has never spoken. The theory became less tidy as the evidence improved. That is not failure. It is what responsible investigation should look like. When the assignment became Murder 101, the classroom project became a podcast in early 2024, following the students' work, the victim identifications, the emergence of John's, and the search for the surviving woman who could describe his method. Episodes returned to the classroom, the press conferences, and later students who continued the assignment. The series also recorded the project's central tension, the desire to finish the story against the reality that official proof remains uneven across the files. On July 13, 2026, a 3-part documentary series based on the podcast arrived on Prime Video worldwide. Directed by Stacey Lee and produced by a team including Stephanie Lydecker, John Watts, and Diane McGonigal. It presents the story as part classroom drama, part investigative process, and part examination of how young people can force an old public record back into view. The title captures the project's improbable origin, but the deeper lesson concerns fragmentation, dignity, and evidentiary limits. The students demonstrated that open-source research can create real investigative value when it is organized, careful, and directed toward official channels. They also showed how attention itself functions as a resource. An old case with no audience may receive fewer tips. A named woman with a photograph, a reconstructed route, and a public campaign is more likely to reach the person who remembers something. Yet the documentary's most marketable claim, that students identified a serial killer behind multiple deaths, should be read alongside the narrower official position. Johns is tied to Tina Farmer through DNA and was convicted in the similar attack on Shaq. No public grand jury finding, or comparable forensic match, has established that he killed every woman associated with the Redhead murders. That distinction is not a spoiler to the project's success. It is the project's deepest educational result. Sociology is not only the study of people. It is the study of how systems create knowledge, how labels acquire authority, and how repeated claims can harden into accepted truth. The students entered the assignment looking for one person. They emerged with a more difficult understanding of how many people it takes to recover one fact. Why the question on the board still matters. The public appeal in Tracy Sue Walker's case remained active as the documentary premiered. Michelle Inman's homicide was still unresolved. Elizabeth Lamott's investigation remained open. S.B. Black Pilgrim and the unidentified Mississippi woman had not received publicly confirmed answers comparable to Tina Farmer's. The class project therefore ends without a total solution, because the record itself has no total solution. What it does have is measurable change. Women once known only by county labels recovered names. A decades-old evidence item produced a DNA match. An offender already convicted of a closely similar attack was formally implicated in Tina's death. A surviving woman's account gained renewed attention. A 15-year-old girl's route from an Indiana shopping center to rural Tennessee became the subject of a reward and a fresh campaign. Students continued working after the original class had graduated. The project also offers a warning. A compelling pattern can revive a case, but it can also absorb unrelated deaths. The pattern must remain a question, not an answer. That is the difference between content and inquiry. Content wants a villain, a twist, and a closing image. Inquiry accepts that one file may close while another opens wider. Campbell's classroom succeeded because it changed the status of the material. The files were no longer dormant objects held by separate institutions. They became shared questions discussed by students, specialists, investigators, relatives, and a wider public. The work did not grant the class legal authority. It gave neglected information momentum. The question on the board was framed as a search for one person among hundreds of millions. Years later, the answer is more complicated. One person was identified through DNA in Tina Farmer's case. Other people may be responsible elsewhere. Some identities returned before accountability did. One witness may still hold the detail that changes Tracy's investigation. The classroom did not solve every mystery it touched. It proved that forgotten does not mean unknowable, and that the first step toward an answer can be as simple and as demanding as refusing to look away. The light source from the window, deep natural shadows, and generous negative space on the opposite side. No people, no recognizable faces, no text, no readable documents, no fake evidence board, no logos, no watermarks, no gore, and no depiction of violence. Premium documentary realism. Tense, but restrained. Crop safe for Squarespace, Google Discover, and social platforms.